Welcome everybody, and a special welcome to Dr. Farhod Yuldas. Dr. Yuldas, after studying political science, got a master in public administration from Central Florida University, then got a PhD in public and international affairs from the University of Pittsburgh, one of the best universities in the United States. He works as a senior statistician at Wells Fargo, and is phenomenally well published, having published among other places in world development. Tonight he will be talking to us about foreign aid and international migration. So Dr. Yuldas, the floor is yours. As we agreed, let's keep it in between 35 and 40 minutes. And once you're done, we'll open it up for a Q&A session. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Peliso. Thank you all. I am honored to be delivering this talk in front of the Nazarbayev University and GSPP community, and I'm looking forward to our interactive discussion afterwards, as well as your feedback. So my talk is titled Foreign Aid and International Migration, and the question is development promotion and development assistance an effective immigration policy? The focus of my presentation is based upon the collaborative research program that I've had over the past few years with my colleague Jonas Gamzo at Arizona State University, as well as Jiko Liu. And this research has been, a few papers from this research program have been published at ISQ World Development, like Professor Peliso mentioned, as well as the Review of International Organizations Journal. The key investigation that we conduct in this research program is priming the relationship between foreign aid and international migration, while differentiating different types of foreign aid across three dimensions. The first one being objectives. Foreign aid projects can have different objectives, such as focusing on governance and institutional development, or helping with economic matters or social matters, right? And location, whether it's in urban areas or in rural areas, or it could be also differentiated in terms of volatility. Is foreign aid consistent across the years, or are foreign aid distributions and disbursements volatile and have wide swings across years? What we do in this research is provide support and show that there are three main arguments that we can support in the literature. The first one is that increases in foreign aid that focuses on development of governance institutions is often associated with lower immigration rates in developing countries. And the second one is that when foreign aid is focused on rural areas, agricultural development and rural development, it is often also accompanied by reduced immigration rates in developing countries. And third, aid shocks or very negatively volatile foreign aid distributions across years are associated with increased immigration rates out of developing countries. So these are the three main claims that we find support for in our research, and we'll get into more detail in the following slides. So why focus on foreign aid and migration? All of this came out of series of coffee catch-ups that I initially, with my colleague Jonas Gamzo, started during the times of, started around 2016, 17, when the salience of immigration issues in the United States and EU have been coming to the fore and becoming really important, along with heightened populism and anti-immigration attitudes going wide with the Trump campaign, as well as his election afterwards, as well as Brexit in the United Kingdom and beyond. Following that is that this is especially the case because of the failure of traditional immigration policy instruments such as border security, and it was a big part of that populist narrative if you remember, and to some extent it continues to be the case, right? Border security and immigration policies being so inefficient and ineffective in sort of regulating the flows of migration have been the key theme in these narratives. And especially the parts that it infringes on human rights have also been widely documented. So with this kind of a failure of immigration policy instruments, there's been alternative policy proclamations by both policymakers as well as scholars, arguing that foreign aid and international development assistance can actually address some of the root causes of why these people are moving across borders in search of better opportunities in advanced industrialized countries. But listening to a lot of policymakers, such as the leaders of U.S., like Obama was making similar arguments as well, and the Danish Prime Minister Rasmussen, as well as the European Commission President José Manuel Barroso, as well as others, arguing that we should increase foreign aid in order to address some of these key problems in developing countries that were pushing people out. But then we started talking about, well, what are the theoretical justifications for such arguments? And also, what evidence is there to support such claims that these foreign aid and addressing these root causes can actually lower the tide of immigration into developed countries? That's how we got started with this research. Economic outcomes. So those who found negative relationship often looked at unemployment, inequality, were some of the issues that the foreign development assistance could help with, therefore lessening the need for migration, for emigration, right, for people out of developing countries. But then there is also a wide literature arguing the opposite. There's actually a positive relationship between foreign aid and international migration. So some scholars looked at and argued that development aid actually exacerbates push factors. It actually makes things worse, right? And that's part of the aid effectiveness and Easterly-Sachs debate as well. And going even beyond that, some found that foreign aid actually enables people to move across borders. So by not only resolving their budget constraints, but also enabling them with information and knowledge to figure out where to move. So puzzled by these different theories, we wanted to look at the evidence. And what we did was look at the evidence where we could find, and we saw that the evidence was also mixed. Some scholars found negative relationship as posited by those theories we just looked at. Some found no relationship between foreign aid and international migration. And then some found positive relationships. So the ones that found positive relationship often looked at foreign aid affecting economic outcomes and allowing people to reach a certain, like the countries to reach a certain level of economic development, after which point then it would actually increase immigration. And they also looked at how aid might enable resolving budget constraints, and most of the aid projects that could really help with is cash transfers, for example, right? In foreign aid, we know that there are some programs that put cash in the hands of people. That could help them buy airplane tickets, for example, if we're going to go that direct, right, in terms of resolving budget constraints. But then other studies looked at foreign aid improving the economic and informational capabilities of people who would then want to migrate. So with this kind of a mixed evidence-based, we started thinking if all aid is actually affects everything the same way. So the biggest assumption in these theories and these papers that we looked at is that they lump all foreign aid together as a monolithic one sort of entity. And that's where we started questioning, well, aren't foreign aid projects different depending on what they're trying to tackle? Don't they have different objectives? Some focus on, humanitarian, aid, like in cases of natural disaster, and some aid focuses on governance, and other aid focuses on social issues, right? Women's rights and elections, and others focus on, just helping governments with their budgets in tough times, right? And then we looked at how aid can have heterogeneous effects as well as impact outcomes through different mechanisms. So thinking about that, we then started getting deeper into like how could not only governance and economic and social aid might affect international movement of people differently, but also think about perhaps rural and urban populations behave differently in the presence of foreign aid in terms of their migration outcomes. And the other thing we looked at is look at the flows of foreign aid. Actually, are they uniform? Do we have sort of more evenly distributed disbursements of aid from year to year? And if not, then, and that's what we found, it turns out actually that foreign aid is not uniform, right? So sometimes countries get a lot of aid and the next year they might get very little aid. So we looked at how that kind of volatility in foreign aid distribution across years could actually undermine all the objectives that they're trying to achieve. Could actually lead to even like worsening corruption and conflict, as well as some negative social outcomes when governments cut spending when they have negative aid shocks. So delving into this different ways that foreign aid could be affecting foreign aid, we started hypothesizing that increases in economic aid are associated with increased immigration rates, as well as social aid, we hypothesized, would also be potentially associated with increased immigration rates, given that, the theories that we just looked at were arguing that, economic aid and social aid could be enabling people to move. In contrast, we hypothesized that governance aid could actually reduce the outflow of people from developing countries, because they could stabilize the government, the focus on executive checks on power, as well as, better functioning government institutions could help people, and the economies, as well as aid that's targeting civil society could also potentially have kind of positive effects on those root causes that might be leading people to leave, right? And then in contrast, we also looked at on the second set of hypotheses where we thought that perhaps rural development aid could also lower immigration, because we know that investments in agricultural development, as well as investments in agricultural infrastructure, could create a lot of not only agricultural employment, but also non-farm rural employment in rural areas, right? So that could have a sort of a lessening effect on the pressure for people to move abroad. We also hypothesized that then the volatility in foreign aid could also be an issue here. And when aid shocks or the huge negative swings in foreign aid could also be pushing people to move abroad, especially for people with lower skills and education. To evaluate these hypotheses, we used a multiple regression approach where we looked at cross-national time series data for 101 low and middle income countries spanning over 1985 and 2010. And we typically use country fixed effects as well, like just grouping the countries as well as the years in our models. excuse me. So our key outcome variable or dependent variable was the estimated emigration rates for aid recipient countries based on the statistics of 20 OECD country census data, which we checked to see that if it actually correlated with the movements of people to the entirety of the OECD countries. And the independent or the explanatory variables we had were the economic aid, governance aid, and social aid as a percentage of country GDPs, following the classifications by Jones and Tarp, as well as the aid data project at William and Mary by Tierney and colleagues. And we also used the aid data classification to disaggregate rural versus urban development aid as percentage of country GDP. And then we used Nielsen and colleagues' approach in identifying aid shocks by focusing on large sudden drops in aid disbursements based on the previous year's flows as percentage of country GDP. And we looked at the 15th percentile and lower to just focus on those largest swings and negative swings in aid disbursements. And we used a variety of control factors to make sure that, we, as best possible, given the methods and approach, isolate the effects of our independent variables, and included a lot of factors such as trade, FDI, the economic expansion in developing countries, right, and OECD terrorism cases, which could affect, the openness of borders as, factors in developed countries. We also looked at the push factors such as poverty and regime type, conflict, and population density from the set of push factors. Excuse me. So what we found were that our hypotheses in terms of economic and social aid contributing to increased immigration rates were not supported. However, we found that governance aid is associated with reduced immigration rates. And this is consistent with some of the literature in aid effectiveness that argues that when aid projects focus on improving government as well as civil society, it could have some stabilizing effects on both the economy as well as the movement of peoples moving abroad. In terms of rural versus urban development, we found that while rural development aid is accompanied by lower immigration rates, we didn't see support for the hypothesis that urban development could increase migration. And in terms of negative aid shocks, or just aid shocks, as it's called in the literature, we saw that could lead to higher immigration rates, especially for lower scaled population. And these hypotheses are tested not in terms of their statistical significance, but also substantive significance was very, very different in terms of the hypotheses that were supported and the ones that weren't. So how do we make sense of these results within the broader literature? First, we base our study as we discussed briefly earlier that, yeah, not all aid is created equally, right? And because different aid projects are different, they could have different outcomes on migration or other outcomes of interest by researchers. And our finding that governance aid lowers immigration, whereas economic aid and social aid don't increase immigration, also makes sense, especially in the context of the revisions and refinement of the debate, the Easterly tax debate, as well as the aid effectiveness literature, where Jones and Tarp and others in the field and NAC as well pointed out that some foreign aid could actually be very effective, especially governance aid. And this also sits well within the aid migration literature, especially by scholars like Clemens and DeHaas, who have pointed out that there could be different sort of impacts and outcomes going on in terms of how aid might be related to migration. And in terms of rural aid versus urban aid, we did look at why rural aid might be associated with lower immigrations, whereas urban aid doesn't, and looked at the preferences of rural versus urban populations, as well as capabilities of rural versus urban populations. And whereas we didn't find much support for the preferences argument, we found some support for the capabilities argument. And in general, it also made sense given the context of studies that found that internal urbanization and internal urban migration could set up sort of extensions to international migration. And then in terms of aid shocks, again, the biggest literature that provides support for this type of argument is the fungibility of aid literature, where expecting or anticipating that foreign aid is coming, governments tend to take funding away from social spending. And this is the fungibility of aid, right? And when aid stops, all of a sudden, that's when they cut public spending, which then affects especially the most vulnerable people in society. Let's see, how am I doing with time? Okay. So what are some of the policy implications that come out from this research? Given that not all aid is created equally, policymakers should focus on clearer foreign aid goals and objectives ahead of time, so that after the fact, they don't get into mission drift, as well as working at cross purposes when they're leveraging different types of aid for different, sometimes politically expedient reasons, right? And governance aid lowering immigration, which suggests that the answer to the question that we asked in the title of the talk, which is development assistance can actually be an effective policy instrument for immigration, but the focus needs to be on governance aid, as we didn't find much support for economic and social aid helping with regulating and mitigating some of that displacement that was happening at the extreme levels, especially. And obviously, we need to make sure that this is not a panacea, right? And the studies such as this one focuses on sort of average effects, meaning that, because of average effects results, we cannot assume that every country is an average country, right? So depending on the types of issues that the country is working on, it might make sense to focus on governance aid for those where it's needed. And same with rural aid, also contributing to lowering immigration rates. It makes sense for policymakers to focus on countries where especially that have high rural populations, right? And high pressure on rural populations, especially if the agricultural prices are depressed, right? Then pressuring them to move out. So in those settings, making urbanization a little more planned and orderly, and also investing in agricultural infrastructure and non-farm employment in rural areas could also help take that pressure off a little bit. And in terms of aid shocks, it could be very helpful for policy actors to develop bilateral or multilateral coordination mechanisms where they could develop some of that trust that's often required to make those wire transfers happen, right? And also reduce some of the complexity of politics of budgeting, as well as the complex financial transfers that need to happen in order to lessen and reduce some of that volatility of foreign aid. And it would also be recommended to look into reducing donor herding, as well as increasing donor diversification to avoid some of these negative effects of aid shocks on certain countries. Because as we know, some projects might seem really good in media and for PR and other political reasons. If a certain project has great potential, we could see a lot of donors kind of herding onto that, or trying to get involved in that project. Whereas less popular projects might not have enough donors to help with. So addressing some of those issues in terms of donor diversification could be helpful as well by reducing the volatility of aid inflows. Now, the key part is, where do we go from here? And would love your feedback on especially this part, but as well as the entire content. So we are thinking about now, and just last week started some work on reviewing some of the literature that was spurred by our research, as well as the literature that we addressed, right? We got some pushback by some of the colleagues, like, for example, Clemens and colleagues pushed back a little on our findings. It was a good, healthy debate. And just not only review some of the newer findings there, but also identify, what are some of the limitations and what kind of studies can we conduct to push this field forward. So we're thinking about an annual review article or some kind of mini book like Cambridge Elements. And the second part of the year, we're planning to investigate the role of foreign aid in climate-induced disasters, because climate is now one of the big push factors, forcing people to move abroad, especially island countries, for example, right? But also others that are affected by global warming, and how foreign aid is helping or not helping, right, with these pressures, is going to be the focus of our next research article. And especially touching upon limitations of such a cross-national time series regression research, we are planning next year to conduct comparative case studies, small n, medium n, to not only clarify the boundary conditions, right? This is a global study, but there could be regional and local boundary conditions for how and why the results of the study might apply, but also kind of dig a little deeper on the mechanisms of how governance aid, for example, or rural aid or the aid shocks might be associated with more directly pushing people out of their homelands. So thank you for your attention. And I think I might be even ahead of time by 3 minutes, as I plan to take 30 minutes, and would love to open it up for questions of answers, if I may, as well as discussion, criticisms, concerns.
Thank you, Dr. Yuldas. It was a fairly interesting, or a very interesting presentation. I will give the floor to Professor Knox, and then I would like to ask a question as well. Colin, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you, Dr. Yuldas, for a very interesting presentation. As I understand it from your presentation, you divided foreign aid into 3 categories: governance, urban and rural dwellers, if you like, and volatility. I'm particularly interested in your operationalization of the term governance, because we know from existing literature that that term has been used and abused. So people like Mary Lee Grindle, for instance, has argued that everything and nothing is governance. It can include all kinds of components, and the boundaries of it have been stretched so far that she now uses the term good enough governance. So particularly given the significance of your finding that governance reduces emigration rates. So my question is more about, how did you operationalize and capture the term governance in your research? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. A very sort of a high level answer would be, right, I would like to start here and then get into the deeper conceptualization of it. So this is how we categorized governance aid in terms of the list of the type of aid projects. So about 10% of the aid projects were governance aid, which then 63% of those focused on government. And then about 37% focused on civil society, NGOs specifically. And how does this operationalization work? Like, what kind of definitions of governance we're using? So I'm kind of now backing into it. The key, as there are so many kinds of definitions of and operationalizations as well of governance, the key thing that we focused on is, especially following the tradition of scholars such as Fukuyama, focusing on, as well as his predecessors, focusing on state capacity, how institutional capacity is so important and not conflating things with like regimes and other things. And so this type of aid that focused on executive checks on power, which provides more a little better distributed distribution of power in a country, that provides on checks on presidential power, right? And a lot of aid projects that focused on, for example, legal institutions and how to improve them, public finance, how we can improve the government's management of money and taxes, right? So I would, and the literature we discuss in the papers, focus on this tradition of researching governance and state capacity.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Omer, go ahead. No, you're muted.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Farhod, for really insightful presentation. One thing, if I missed, I'm not sure at the beginning if I missed that, you rely on officially recorded immigration, and the illegal immigration, is it included in your data, or is it another picture? Or because that might actually, if it's excluded, if I missed that part, I didn't want to interrupt back then.
Yeah, this is, the short answer is the way in which the immigration rates are calculated do not distinguish legal versus illegal types of migration, because there's no such data as we know it to actually even just point out the flows of people from country to country over time. And that's why we had to use estimates that kind of backed into immigration rates from the country census statistics from 20 OECD countries.
Okay, the reason I'm concerned is because if you leave that there's big like dark cloud over there, and if you leave that out, because most of the migration from these very poor countries happens not like officially, does not appear immediately on the statistics, and if you leave them out from the statistics, then the results might look different compared to if we had all those data in a visual sense. I mean, if we had those data, then we might have actually a different picture. So like I might expect like the more country receives aid, that actually increases or plays with the push factors. And that might actually change the pictures. What's your comment on that? I mean, are you concerned about that kind of an omission?
Yeah, that's a valid concern, definitely. And if we had the data, right, excuse me, if we had the ability to disaggregate that in the data, it would be a great study. However, the way this data is calculated, it includes all, but it does not distinguish because there's no way to distinguish from the data based on the country census. No census asks people, right? Are you here illegally or legally? But your concerns are valid, and that's why ideally we need to conduct more studies where perhaps it's going to be more like case studies or focusing on particular countries, because it's really tough in terms of resources and effort to measure this globally, right? For every country.
Hi, Song.
Okay. Thank you very much for presentation. It's a very interesting topic, and yeah, very curious. But I'm a little bit confusing because the paper you shared, you sent is the 2021, is different to what the content, what you present today, right? And because 2021, you tested low education, low skill immigrant and then high skilled immigrant measured by education, these things, right? So, and then you didn't show any real output data, the regression results or panel regression output. So I cannot see clearly. But it's could you explain more about your data is the panel data, right? The country panel data, right? It's the country level. It's not individual level.
That's right.
The immigrant level, not. Okay. This is a little bit the confusing because so I'm thinking you actually because I worry about the ecological fallacy because you aggregate it, right? In the country level, but your interpretation you seems like an individual level your interpretation. So I think I want to point out that one first. And then second one is the you just check the shock is a bottom 50%, right? And then you distinguish this aid shock with economic aid or governance aid, and then the other aid, right? And then you said this negative shock whether increased or decreased the emigration rate, right? But did you check about the opposite way? Kind of a, what is it? The upper 50% when the shock also increased, it is to show the opposite way. It's not really symmetric, but asymmetric, but it's better to see whether this happens is really happens when the opposite shock comes, right? Then maybe better proof on your argument. That's my second point. And third point is your is what it is, this governance aid or economic aid. This is the categorical, you categorize from ODA, official development agreement or aid, and then each items you categorize governance aid and then economic aid and other aid. That's a little bit yeah, that's what I want. Yes.
Yeah, I didn't want to show these pages right away. This could take up a lot of time, but yeah, this is these are important questions, and I'm glad you're asking. What was your third question? I'm just trying to make sure that I capture.
Oh, this is how you divided the economic aid and governance aid, other aid. This is the official ODA, right? And then you subcategories.
Yes, yeah. So I will start with your third question.
Yeah, and then how you so categorize rural development and urban development. How do you distinguish these things? Is it because it's explanation is not enough, and then you didn't share the paper you presented, so I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah. So so the paper, I'm not sure which one you looked at, but I shared links to 3 papers. So these are results from 3 papers, and I wanted to share like higher level insights and open it for discussion at a higher level. But obviously, we can get into all the results, and I'll try to do it quickly here. So this is how the aid project at the College of William and Mary categorized. They had like big funding, and they went through the data and categorized it in this way. So we leveraged that. We could not have had the time to do it on our own, to go through the entire 25 years worth of aid projects. So this one is for the first, and this one is for rural and urban development. So since we did not have geocoded data, we could not get that exact location and then operationalize it that way. We used this categorization as a proxy for urban versus rural aid. as to the paper, right? I think the one you read is talking about the third set of hypotheses that I mentioned here. So 3A, 3B, I think that's the paper you read. But these are sort of, we didn't write these three papers at the same time, right? These are like things we did on the side on the weekends because it's such an interesting topic for us. And we wrote the first one, and then we wrote the second one, and then we wrote the third one. But I wanted to bring it all together and to get feedback on, like, what it means and where we can go next. But in terms of the statistical questions, real quick. So on the positive shocks, theoretically, you could expect positive shocks to, right? If we follow Clemens and De Haas, put a lot of money on people's hands, right? Which is a very convenient economic argument, I would say, and not to stir a debate with economist colleagues here. But I think it's an assumption that needs to be tested, right? If aid projects, especially booms like positive shocks such as that, put money in people's hands. But we did run those in our robustness checks, but we didn't find any relationship. We also used not just 15th percentile, but also, we kind of increased the range to see if there are effects of even less swings, right? We didn't find support for that as well. And we followed the tradition in the literature, especially by Nielsen and colleagues and a few others who had approached the definition and operationalization of foreign aid in this manner. And we used the negative shocks, and the way we did it is we created a binary dummy variable to just indicate the years and the countries where they had these kind of wildly negative swings in aid. And lastly, on the country versus individual level, of course, our studies at the country level, but we're using the theories and the evidence in the literature that also focuses on the individual level. And some of our data in the second paper does look at some of the survey data. It's the World Development article. We do look at individual level survey data, but only from Afrobarometer, because we couldn't find that, from all different barometers across the world. But we are kind of using the knowledge that's already accumulated in the literature to kind of make sense of our macro level findings here in this study.
Okay. Thank you. It's okay. Just made a quick question. Another one. Mm-hmm. Okay. So your third hypothesis.
No, sorry. I sounded. I'm sorry, but we have Artan.
Okay, then
Peter,
I will ask later. Then. Thank you.
Thank you. Artan, please.
Hello, Dr. Yuldas. Nice to virtually meet you. Very interesting presentation and very well-articulated findings and policy implications as well. Sorry, we are bombarding you with questions, but that's for a good reason. I have two questions regarding the literature review side and the methodological aspect of your research. First of all, there is a whole debate out there regarding the engagement of foreign aid with aid effectiveness. And actually, there is quite a lot of literature when it comes to the high-level forums of OECD, in particular, Paris Declaration, the Accra Agenda for Action, and the Busan Partnership of 2005, 8, and 2011, if I'm not mistaken, that actually speak to various areas of governance and the topic that you've chosen to research, the connection between aid and immigration. I wonder if you have engaged with a debate to actually substantiate some of your arguments regarding aid effectiveness in the specific sector of migration. So that's question number one. Question number two is from a methodological perspective. I'm not going to comment on your deductive approach to the whole thing because I don't claim to be the deductive guru, but I wonder if there is any geographical scope when it comes to the claims that you are making, right? Your blankets conclusion, so to speak, when it comes to the relationship between governance aid and urban versus rural aid and everything, do they specifically apply to a region? Because what we know for sure in the aid effectiveness debate is that the effectiveness is highly contextualized and is highly politicized as well, right? I wonder what is your take on that?
Thank you. On the first one, that sounds like a great place to look in terms of further research, because we did not disaggregate the migration of side of things, right? As you saw, we focused on the assumptions that, all aid was equal. We kind of focused on actually differentiating different types of aid. But I think it's a logical place to go next to also look at different types of migration. And what's amazing is that we have seen a lot of people since we published these articles in the last couple of 2-3 years even, to focus on, for example, one paper just recently wrote how it affects nurses and doctors migration, for example. And we started seeing a lot of papers just focusing on one country or one region, to your other point, right? So that's why we feel the need to kind of bring it all together and look at what has been published, since we published these papers, and how all of those publications, and we have been also reviewing quite a bit of manuscript submissions as well, right? So there's rich literature now that allows us to kind of fill in some of the holes in our work, if you will, given the methodologies we used, right? And these are, even though we controlled for different regional effects in our multiple regressions, right? Fixed effects models, but still, it would be good to look at some of those case studies and also do case studies of our own. And that's where we would like to head. And the beauty of, talking to an audience like this in a policy school is, right, like everyone comes from different literature, different methodologies, and that's where knowledge comes together. And obviously, global sort of average effects findings need to be complemented and contextualized by different regional findings. And that only can lead to better understanding, I believe.
Okay, just very quickly, I'm curious, are you associated with the politics school or GSPP at Pitt?
I finished GSPP.
GSPP. Okay.
Okay, Peter, Professor Howie.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Yuldas, for an interesting presentation. I just have one question, and it's to deal with return migration, because your presentation doesn't actually incorporate return migration at all. And some researchers have, calculated that over 40% of the migrants that come to the US actually return to their own countries. So, so as a consequence, how, knowing this, I know you haven't dealt with it, but, is there a way in the data to actually deal with this return migration and understand, what the net migration is from a country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And return migration is an important part of the migration narrative as phenomenon, right? To the extent that it's, we focus on, let's say, some of the investments made by migrants, right? Some migrants move back. For example, we have a lot of Mexican-American entrepreneurs who have come to the US and then move back to Mexico and invest in their countries a lot, right? To some extent, that data is potentially captured in the FDI measures we have, right? But it's not distinguished, obviously. But in terms of the actual return migrants, our data, as you said, also doesn't, can't handle that. But I think, and the same goes for remittances, right? We know, for example, countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, as well as Uzbekistan to some extent, they rely on remittances to a great extent as percentage of their GDPs. So that would be also kind of a more like a future research, because we haven't been able to address that issue. But there's a huge literature on that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Simeon and then Omer. And then we need to close.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. I liked it. I just have a quick question. You're talking about remittances now, actually. If you look at the balance of payments, there's a lot of incomes that can come to the country. FDI is one of them. is there, but remittances is another, and it could be correlated with the foreign aid.
Mhm.
So just my advice is you need to put a few more income stream there to see better control the regression
Mhm.
and the results. And another question I wanted to ask you, sometimes a disaster happens, and what happens? A big emigration from the country occurs, right? And a lot of foreign aid comes in the country as well.
Mhm.
So that might produce
Curious.
somewhat correlations that are positive of foreign aid driving emigration out.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like a reverse causality thing that might occur, in terms of sometimes you might see that, or sometimes one event can cause emigration and foreign aid to occur. I think you should be controlling for that kind of stuff, or just see some case studies on that.
Mhm.
It'd be interesting.
Yeah. Thank you for a suggestion on including more income streams. We'll take a look at that one for sure. And in terms of humanitarian aid, both in terms of the flows of money as well as the flows, like outflows of people, that's a key thing to kind of check for. And we did look at it in our robustness checks. So we try to exclude the humanitarian projects in especially a first paper as well as the third, because especially in the third paper, it affects the volatility, right? If you include all the humanitarian flows. So, and most of the volatility could be potentially coming from there. And therefore, we actually excluded the humanitarian disaster, aid flows, so that we're not just capturing that, right? And the results were still supported. And in terms of reverse causality, we did have a few specifications that control for endogeneity, and especially we did lots of those in the first paper, but we've done some on the third paper as well to show that what we're finding is not actually driven by reverse causality, as you mentioned.
Okay.
Professor Barish, and then
Okay.
maybe quickly, Haysam.
My question is, in addition to my previous question, after I saw your regression tables, I noticed that the number of countries is around 202 and 103. Now, obviously, I'm going to ask about like the pattern in any patterns in the countries that are excluded, because as far as I know, we have around 190 or 200 countries in the world. And if there are any patterns, and obviously my guess goes in the direction that, okay, if these people are moving from their country, the high income ones will have the opportunity to move to, I don't know, to European Union, to the US, to Australia, to Canada, more richer countries, but the poorest ones will actually go to, I don't know, neighboring another poor country just to actually get some relief that is what they can afford in terms of movement, in terms of moving or migrating from their home country. So if there is a pattern of low-income countries excluded from your analysis, then again, are you actually omitting the most important part that would affect your results?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's the reason we focused only on developing countries is because our migration measurement is focused on immigration, right? And therefore, we looked at the countries where people are leaving. And I think, and also we're only focusing on the movements of people from developing countries to the developed north, right? So therefore, our data is a bit limited in scope from that perspective, but we should definitely start looking at, for example, migration from developing countries to another developing countries, especially in emerging economies, right? There's a huge number of people moving just from south to south. and as well as from north to north as well, right? There's still people within Europe moving around, or from Europe to the US and Canada and vice versa, and as well as from, you know, different parts like from Japan and Korea, Singapore as well. So it's definitely going to be part of, you know, our overall review, as well as what we need to look at next.
All right, thank you.
Hi Song, no,
Yeah.
sorry, Mary, it's go ahead.
Thank you. Let me. Can you show the other result? The see, you know, the what is the low education, medium education, the data, the output. Yeah. So basically, I think you did the for 15 years, sometimes one, and then you low education only immigrant aggregate in the country level, and then medium education individual you aggregate country level, and higher education, right? That's why you have an observation, so all of 506 country year, right?
Yeah.
I think that this is a reasonable analysis, because when you have a big shock, age shock, and then you individual only selected a low education and educated, aggregated, and then you see the regression. I think it's in order to argue this one, maybe you just not this what the country level, but you do better as a multi-level one, because otherwise you cannot argue this is a low education really have a shock compared to the medium or higher education, right? So and then I don't know, is it okay only with sample selection, right? We only selected the low education and then only select the medium education and aggregate it. That's my third final question.
Yeah, it's kind of partly we're constrained by the way these immigration rates are measured, but I see your point. Ideally, we would have the education level provided as another control variable or another independent variable, right, that we can disaggregate. But unfortunately, the way they calculated from the OECD country census statistics, they were only able to, you know, just split the measures in such way, and we couldn't do otherwise. But, you know, your point is well taken, and, you know, ideally that's the kind of data we should look at and the kind of analysis we should look at to be able to fully say, like, you know, this is how you control for education levels. Yeah.
Okay, Omer, do you want to have a final question?
Sure. Yeah. Please.
No, I think there's. Yeah.
No,
Oh.
I forgot to lower my hand. Sorry.
All right. So I think we have run out of questions. Thank you so much. I think it was a very fascinating presentation, and I think it spoke to the research that many of us are doing. I think it was appealing for our more quantitatively inclined colleagues, to those less quantitatively inclined who are actually interested in aid. I think migration is a super exciting area of inquiry. So I think it was a very interesting presentation, and we were very glad to have the opportunity to listen to you. And, you know, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you,
to all the
Dr.
participants.
Yuldas. Okay, nice to meet you.
Thank you. Likewise. And thank you for all the great questions and feedback. And please feel free to reach out if you have any more feedback, questions, or concerns.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Have a good evening.